Hi, I'm Kiwikana and welcome back to my art channel. Today I'm going to be walking you through a recent commission I did. This is going to be kind of a relaxed video, so grab a cup of coffee or draw along with me and I'll walk you through my process. I accept my commissions either through DMs or through my page on Artistry, and they usually take around 3 weeks to complete. I have my clients send me as much information as possible on the characters they want in the illustration, or what the background is going to look like, any particular colors or vibes that they want, anything like that, and then I start thumbnailing. This particular piece is an Okami commission with several characters from the game included and a sort of cherry blossom theme in the background, so that's what I based everything off of, and a special shout out to my client who so graciously gave me permission to post about this piece so that all of you can see it. Right now, I'm showing you the process for the thumbnail that was approved. I usually do anywhere between 2 to 4 thumbnails for these commissions, but I generally only send off one, the one that I like the most. I feel like it's a little less complicated for everyone that way, and if there are ever any issues with that particular thumbnail, I can send off all my other thumbnails to choose from, but 9 times out of 10, the original thumbnail is approved and I get to move on to coloring. That's what happened for this commission. My sketch was approved and I got to move on to the next step. I feel like my clients have a lot of trust in me because I don't usually send off super clean line art during this stage. I do try to keep things a little cleaner or more refined if it's not personal work. If this was a piece for myself, I probably would have stopped sketching after I just really roughly blocked everything in, and that's because I can kind of see in my mind where everything is going to go, and I have faith in myself that I'll be able to complete it. But other people can't see what I have in my head, so everything has to be a lot more tidy. I definitely spend a lot more time sketching when it's for a commission, and I make sure that I'm not leaving out any details to just figure out later, which is something I do in my personal work all of the time. Okay, so after my sketch was approved, I started in with color, and I'm just blocking in everything really roughly here. Everything looks a little desaturated to start with, and then you can see that I amp up the saturation later on. That's something that I do really often. I feel like my work always starts out with not a lot of saturation, and then slowly but surely I build it up over time. I'm also just going in and putting in a color layer over all of my line art, and that's because I'm going to paint directly over it. And I don't want that black to show through, so changing it to some sort of reddish brown color is going to help everything look a little more harmonious. We're not going to get any of that black making things look muddy, which is something that I definitely don't want. That color layer just makes my life a lot easier. Now, I'll usually send another update somewhere around this stage where the colors are just really roughly blocked in, and that's because if there are any glaring issues that a client doesn't like with the colors, I'd like to catch them really early. For me, making adjustments to a pose or the actual sketch is a lot easier than completely overworking all of the colors later on, so it's really important that I avoid having to massively change those later in the process as much as possible. A lot of times I'll actually send over multiple options when it comes to color, often no more than 2 or 3. I feel like color dictates a lot more about an atmosphere than the actual sketch, so giving multiple options lets my client have a little more control over the actual vibe of the piece. Now for this one, we already knew that we were including these cherry blossoms. We wanted the piece to be set in a cherry blossom forest with this sort of relaxed atmosphere, so I already had a good sense of the overall palette that I would be using. I knew I needed to include these pinks and greens for the forest, and I also had a lot of information about color based off of the actual character designs. Waka has this really strong red and pink in his design, so that's going to inform some of the choices I make. For those reasons, I actually only sent off one color comp, and my client really liked the direction that we were going in, so there were no issues there. You can see I also changed the anatomy of the leg pose a little bit while I was working, and sometimes it's hard for me to see how the actual forms are going to read until I start adding in color and can really break those down. So it felt like the positions of the legs just looked a little awkward, but that's a really easy fix. At this point in the illustration, I just have to render everything. I don't know if anyone else can relate, but once I hit around this point of the drawing where I'm just really starting to clean things up and everything is pretty much solidly blocked in, I can kind of just turn my brain off. Every once in a while, I have to remind myself where the actual forms are sitting, so I just try to picture everything as a cube, and that helps me decide where the light versus dark values are going to be, but otherwise, I don't really think about much when I'm rendering. I can put on the TV or listen to an audiobook while I'm working. I think this week that I was doing the commission, I also had 2 others I needed to complete, and I listened to 3 audiobooks during that time. So if you have any books that you really like to listen to, drop them in the comments. I'm always looking for more suggestions. I will say, if you're just starting out taking commissions, or if it's something that you want to do in the future and you just haven't started yet, my absolute biggest piece of advice is to get really, really comfortable taking feedback and being ready and willing to make adjustments. I got really lucky with this particular client. They pretty much never asked me to change anything. They really trusted me throughout this whole process. My work goes through a lot of really messy stages, but they were 100% down with every decision I made the whole time, and that was really, really great. But it's kind of rare in my experience to get a lot of clients like that, and that's not a bad thing. I want to be perfectly clear that I do not expect clients to ask for no changes. Asking for things to be adjusted or not being 100% happy with a particular element of the illustration right at the beginning is such a normal part of taking client work, and it doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong, and it doesn't mean that you're a bad artist. It just means that sometimes it takes a little bit of finagling to get your client's vision to really match up with what you're putting on the page. I always say when I'm getting ready to start a project that I am always super happy to make any adjustments that a client wants along the way. And that's another reason that I like to take a little bit of extra time on commissions, because you never know if there's something you're going to have to change. You want to make sure that you have a little bit of a buffer in your time estimations. Another thing to keep in mind if you're starting to take commissions is that you're not always going to be able to just draw what you're super comfortable with. For example, I draw a lot of characters in my work, and I'm pretty confident in my ability to draw a pose or to get a face right, but other elements of an illustration might pose a bit of a challenge for me. I don't draw a lot of animals in my work, so I don't have as much experience painting in fur, but 2 of my commissions on the week that I was working on this Okami piece both included different animals that were both furry. So before I took these on, I had to make sure I felt confident that I could do a good job with these textures that I'm a little less familiar with. Now, of course, it's always okay to turn down a commission that you don't feel like you'll succeed at. For example, a lot of artists say no to mech art or furry art if it's something that they're just not as experienced with. There's nothing wrong with that. But I do think if you want to be successful at taking commissions, you need to get pretty comfortable with a variety of materials and objects, so practicing things like fur or leather or metal is going to be really important. Now, the really good thing is that if you get pretty comfortable and confident in your ability to capture light and shadow when it comes to simple geometry, simple forms, it's going to be a lot simpler to paint all of these different materials that you might be a little less familiar with. At this point, I'm really just cleaning up the background and painting in all of those details. Painting plants and forests is one of my favorite things to do, and I find it really meditative. I don't use any special or fancy brushes for this. I just paint everything in with a really simple square brush, and I try to focus on light and shadow rather than drawing really detailed individual leaves or anything like that. Like, if you zoom in really closely on any of my paintings of forests, you can see that I'm pretty much just drawing in random splotches, and when you zoom out, it kind of works, or at least I hope it does. I also just added in a layer of the background color with an airbrush over top of all the elements of the illustration that are sort of further in the background. This helps blur everything out a little bit and also gives a sense of atmospheric perspective. I usually add in that sky color once I have more of the details finalized because it gives the image a lot more depth. Now you'll start to see the epic struggle that ensued when I tried to paint in these flowers in the foreground. I'm pretty sure I painted and then painted over them many times because they just didn't really read correctly in perspective to me. Sometimes I feel a little nervous to make foreground elements really big because I know that flowers are small and Waka, who's the person in this illustration, is larger than flowers, so making them so huge can sometimes feel a little nerve-wracking. But it's really important to remember when you're painting that the way you see things in your head is not actually what they would appear to look like. So I ended up having to make these flowers a lot bigger than I originally would have thought they would be to make them look like they were closer to the camera in perspective. You can see I'm adding in all of this detail work with these flowers right now. I paint over all of this later on, so it really truly was just a waste of time, but you know, that's okay. I had a lot of fun working on them, and I definitely learned a little bit about painting flowers while doing this, so maybe it wasn't such a waste. Now, I still needed to add Isun to the foreground per my client's request, and I really wanted to make sure that he didn't get lost with all of the detail in the background. Luckily, the Okami games already so creatively solved that problem for me. Because he's so small, the artists behind these games include a sort of glowing green overlay behind him. That's totally genius, so I just included that in this illustration because it matches the art style of the game, and it really helps separate Isun from the background. Now, I still really did not like how the foreground was reading, so as promised, I painted it all out and started again. I try to remember not to get too precious with any of my work, so even though I really liked all of these flowers and I had spent a lot of time drawing them, they weren't serving the overall piece, so instead of getting frustrated and trying to desperately make them work when they just didn't, I embraced it and just started over. I also flipped my canvas while I was doing this. I feel like if there's an element that you're really struggling with, flipping the canvas is often really helpful because it helps you see everything in a new light, and I definitely needed that for this section of the drawing. Now it's time for the obligatory self-promotion. My commissions are open, so if you ever want to, you can find the link in my channel description as well as the description in all of my videos. If you click on the link to my link tree, you can find my commission page as well as all of my social media platforms. Okay, now we're getting to the really fun part of this illustration, adding in the overlays and some of that forest lighting. I just do that with an add layer. I like to paint in dappled light from the trees as well as these beams of light shining through. I feel like it makes everything look very dynamic. And finally, I'm painting in some cherry blossoms that are just blowing in the wind. And with that, everything is pretty much finished. Thank you so much for watching. I'll have a new video for you next week. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and I hope I'll see you in the next one.